Well, good morning, and welcome to the first week of our class. This is a fairly exciting class, or certainly can be. It's about change and innovation and creativity. Innovation and creativity are topics that are really at the forefront of leadership these days. One of the fastest growing areas of research and study and interest for people in the field of leadership. So hopefully this class is a bit of a primer for you and get you at least a basic understanding of what's going on in that part of our field of study, and maybe spark some interest on your part. Again, it's being studied and written about all over the place. You pretty much can't click on anything or read anything that doesn't somehow touch on this stuff, it seems, these days. So this is our introduction to it. Obviously, week one, we're just diving in, getting our feet wet, understanding what these concepts are, and a little dealing with a little bit of change. Because obviously, innovation and creativity leads to change, and then we need to lead change through our organizations. One point I want to make: there is a difference between management and leadership. I hope at this point you all understand that. Even in the textbook, they tend to use the terms interchangeably, and even on our PowerPoints for the class, unfortunately, it tends to talk about things that are really leadership related as management. There's definitely a difference, and we should always be aware of those differences. So just to recap those differences, obviously leadership is about people, and about inspiring people and leading. We lead people. Management is about getting the tasks done. And you go back to some of the work that Peter Drucker did and John Kotter did as well back in the early 70s, where the concepts first got split, where we really started understanding that there is a difference between leadership and management. And that's what spurred the study of leadership and why you have a program in leadership to study, because it is different than management. So keep that in mind when you're going through some of the course materials. Even though they're using they can use the terms interchangeably, they aren't. They're different. So our textbook, just a few ideas about our textbook. If you looked at the backgrounds of the authors, they're not American. They're, I think one's a Brit and one's an Australian. So they're writing in what would be termed the Queen's English, not U.S. English. So they use terms like amongst and they use S's where Z should be in certain organizations. Don't copy that into your writing. We're writing in U.S. English, so use our terms. That's something that's common as you're doing research and you're finding research that others have done. They have the peculiarities of their language. You have to kind of translate that into our own language in your writing. As we go into week two, we're really going to dig into some of the change theories, and there are a bunch out there. Some are more famous than others. You'll be exposed to a number of them. The real key is to understand that there's not one right theory. If there was, there would be just one. We wouldn't have all these different theories. And when you're actually applying change leadership theory, you're going to bring together a number of these theories. Typically, when I'm doing some kind of leadership change plan, I'm using a minimum of 2 theories, usually 3 or 4. And if you've had any experience with consultants who are doing helping an organization lead change, they typically have a program. And what they've done with that program is they've taken 3 or 4 or maybe 5 of these theories and cobbled them together to create their program. So it's really how change is done and how it's theorized. You put together the different components to come up with what really works in the context you're looking at. So keep that in mind as you're going through all these theories. Some work better than others in certain contexts, and that's really what we have to understand and determine when we're applying this stuff. What's our context and what really will work best? And when you're thinking about context, it's things like what's the environment, what's the industry, what are the people groups that are involved? Because people all react differently, and if you're in a multicultural situation, people understand and behave differently than our Western view. And there's some, hopefully you'll get to it in your studies, but there's some really good work about that. I rely heavily on that. Even in the U.S., we work in multicultural environments, and it's really important to understand how folks really view things and interact with each other. It's very different. The Western way is unique and not necessarily the best. And one of the issues that in the early days, and I suppose to a certain extent still today, in the study of leadership, from the Western side, we tended to view, well, this is the way leadership was done, and it should be universal. And so people found when they went to Asia and the subcontinent, India, that it failed. It failed miserably. And it's because we didn't understand culture and how people really relate and how they understand and what their expectations are. So it's all very important. And as I live in California. This is a hugely multicultural state. I know a number of you in Florida. That's a very multicultural state as well. So we encounter that here in the U.S. We don't have to go to a foreign country, but certainly if you do, if you go to the Asian cultures, Indian cultures, some of the Middle Eastern cultures, they're very different than ours, and they just view life differently. And they view leadership differently accordingly. So if you want to be successful in those environments and with those folks who have migrated here that we're working with, we need to design our leadership to understand that and to take that into account. So you'll get exposed to some of those change theories next week as we continue to march down this road. Just some pointers for the class, and so you understand how I look at things. You're required in your discussions and really in your journals you're writing to have the term used by St. Thomas is academic. It's interchangeable with scholarly. Your resources have to be academic or scholarly. That means there has to be research behind them. So a few things that aren't that don't qualify as academic or scholarly are any newspapers, any magazines. Magazines are not scholarly, like Forbes. Forbes is not a there's no scholarly work in Forbes. It's just a magazine. It's published to make money. Scholarly journals are not published to make money. They're published to put research out there. And if you get a subscription to one, they tend to be expensive because they don't have a huge subscription base, and they're not selling advertising. So there is a big difference between a magazine and a scholarly journal. YouTube videos are not scholarly. Google searches, web pages are not scholarly. We're really looking for journals. The expectation is that you're finding 2 journal entries to support your work each week, at least 2, which means you're in the library searching. And that's really the essence of doing doctoral work is scouring the academic work that's out there, the scholarly work that's been done, and then starting to build your theories and how you're informed about your leadership in our case. And really that's when you go to do your dissertation, one whole chapter will be on that. You have to do a lit review, and that's what it is. You have to go out and take a look at what's out there already in the subject area you're studying. And your goal is to find something that hasn't been studied or that needs to be studied further. And that's the point of a literature review, to establish that, yes, there's a reason for you doing your work and how it's going to add to our body of knowledge. So building the skills now of how to find those journal entries, journal articles, and the entries you're going to create from them is a good skill. So that's the expectation. Obviously, you'll be citing this book and citing from this book. Again, they're bringing together a lot of the resources for you. So they're going to cite Cotter next week. They're going to cite some of the other theorists, and you'll be citing them as well. But you also need to go find out what's current. Kind of the hierarchy of of importance of academic or scholarly work is journals are the top because they're the most current, and we want to know what's going on currently, especially in the areas we're studying, innovation, creativity. It's so volatile right now. Things happen every day because it's an area that everybody's focusing on. So we want to know what's going on now. What are the trends? What have they discovered in their research? Is there a different way we need to look at things? And that's the point. So scholarly journals are always the top. They're the most important. You can debate this, but maybe some dissertations might follow, dissertations might follow that. You have to be careful about dissertations. Not all of them are good. And for that matter, not all journal articles are all that good. You need to read critically and determine, is there value in this? A journal article is really a mini dissertation. It'll have all the parts of a dissertation. And a key point is obviously look at the lit review. It's going to be rich and full of information that even if this article stinks, if they've done a good lit review, it will give you a lot of information that you can then pursue. Actually, the most important thing I look at when I look at a journal article is the reference list, because I find things that I really want to go read. But the lit review will help that as well. Then the next thing is, how do they perform their study? Did they do a good job? And you get to be the determinant of that when you're deciding if you're going to cite them. You don't want to cite somebody who didn't do a good job in their research, or if you have issues with. And you don't have to agree with everything that these guys write either. In fact, it's good to challenge those kind of things. That's how we advance our field of study. You don't have to agree with things that I say. We want to have this dialogue, and we want to have a critical view of what we're doing so that we move forward and get to the best answers. I hesitate to say the right answers, because until you do something, you don't know if it's right. And that's the way research goes. And that's the way consulting goes sometimes. But we want to get to our best answer. And that's through challenging what's being done. And to a certain extent, your dissertation is about challenging what has been done or hasn't been done in the past. And obviously applying it to an area that hopefully is very interesting to you, a very particular context. So keep that in mind. Books are really at the bottom of the list because they're dated. This one has been updated a few times. I think the last time was 2 or 3 years ago, so it's fairly current. But unless it's a seminal work by one, some of these theorists you'll read about next week for Change, unless you're reading about some of the seminal work that maybe Cotter did, books get dated very fast. And well, they're dated as soon as they come out. The publication process is a 2 to 3 year process, and before that you had to do the research, so that could be another 2 years. So by the time a book hits your desk, the research in it could be 5 or 6 years old, and really anything over 10 years is considered old. So keep that in mind. You want to do current things. Now you can cite things that are more than 10 years old. Obviously, if you're citing Cotter, he did a lot of his work in the 70s and 80s. So it's okay to cite that because his theory is a seminal theory. In my dissertation, I cited some work from the 70s because that's when the thought process in the area I was looking at began. So it's okay to have some of that if it's seminal. If it's not the seminal work, if it's not the thing that kicked everything off or was thought to be a key point in the study, it's not seminal, and it was just what happened along the way. It may be important for you to show, like when you're doing your lit review, that this happened along the way and this is where we're going and how we've gotten where we are. But you don't want to rely on a bunch of old stuff, especially in change, creativity, and innovation, because it's so changing so rapidly. So books would be kind of the bottom of that list. Journal articles, some dissertations, if they're done really well and from reputable institutions, and then books, scholarly books. And most of the scholarly books are going to be expensive because, again, there's not a huge market for them. It's not like romance novels that they sell in the airport. You won't. It's hard to find a scholarly book at the airport bookstore, let me tell you. They're just not written for that. And most of them are come out of Sage or other publishers like that, and they're expensive. I've got a number on my bookshelf from my dissertation that cost me a lot of money that I'm never getting rid of because they cost me a lot of money and I'll never get a payback. And besides, they're generally seminal works. But At any rate, so keep that hierarchy in mind. That's what we're after. Find those journal entries. You should be searching every week. That's how you're going to grow and develop, looking at what's out there from week to week as we look at different issues. Some other things to keep in mind: there's a difference between scholarly and anecdotal. Anecdotal is people relating their experiences. Now, your charge when you're doing your dissertations is to kind of meld your anecdotal work with the scholarly work we're working with. So you're talking about situations where you've been in or you've experienced, and then we want you to relate them to the theories we're studying. So we want you to recognize, oh, this was really what we were talking about in chapter 1 in this area, or this is really what Cotter was talking about, and relate it to that. So it's okay in our context to deal with some anecdotal work. You don't want to rely on anecdotal work. And a lot of things that come out of the church world are anecdotal. There's very, very little research done in the church world. There are a couple groups who do some, but the vast majority is anecdotal. It's based on life experiences. And that's valuable if you're living exactly the same life as that author. And none of us do, so you can tell you how limited that is. So just to give you an idea of people who are anecdotal that I wouldn't really rely on, John Maxwell, and you'll run into him in your classes. It's typical to run into Maxwell in leadership classes, but his work is not scholarly, so I wouldn't rely on it much. It's interesting, but there's no research behind it, and that's what's. And we're talking about scholarly stuff. That's what's important. And Simon Sinek is pretty popular right now because he's a very charismatic speaker, but his work is not scholarly. It's all anecdotal. He's just putting together. Nothing he's talking about is new. It's all this stuff we've known for years he's putting together and then talking about experiences. So it's anecdotal. So be careful about relying on folks like that. Their stuff's interesting, and Sinek is very, very charismatic. So he's got a big following, but he's not talking about anything new, frankly. And he's not giving a lot of credit to the people he's borrowing from, which I have issues with, but that's me. So keep that in mind when you're looking for sources. We're really looking for good scholarly work to build, to use as the foundation for what we're building on, and to help us understand what people have done and what they're doing in our area of study. Make sure you're meeting the minimum word requirements in your work. It shouldn't be difficult at this level. We've got lots to write about, but the art is writing concisely and to the point. Obviously, we're using APA style in our writing, so it's proper English, no contractions, all that kind of stuff. Make sure we're citing correctly. Every time you make a statement of fact, it requires a citation. Otherwise, it's just your uninformed opinion. And we can't rely on your opinion because we're not living your life. So if you're citing, if you say, all companies do this, well, first of all, you should never use the word all, because all companies have never been researched. It's an impossibility. So you need to be cautious. You shouldn't use words of magnitude like all, every, most. We don't know all. We don't know every. We don't even know most. When you get into your dissertation work, you're going to understand you're going to be looking at samples. Samples aren't all, and they're not every, and you have to be careful how you generalize them, that information. When you're looking at these journals that journal articles you're going to find, they'll have a discussion of what their research means, and one of the key points is to understand how they're applying it and how they're trying to generalize it. Not everything can be generalized very far. I did a case study. Case studies can't be generalized. Case studies really point to what happened in a certain situation and develop more areas for study. So you can't generalize it to a larger population. So you need to be careful about those kind of things. Don't use words of magnitude. Make sure you're citing all statements of fact. If it truly is a fact, we want to know where it came from. That's why, you're borrowing it from someone else, so you don't want to plagiarize. You want to give credit where credit's due. Plus, you want to tell your readers where this came from so they can explore it. Like I said, the most important thing I look at is the reference list when I'm reading articles. I want to know what in there is interesting that I want to go explore. I want to prove for myself. Or if you're making a point, I might say, wow, that's a really good point. I want to see how this applies in other areas. So proper citations are important to help us do that. And then the references that go along with them. So make sure you're following the guidelines in APA. It's chapter 6 for citations and chapter 7 for references. I noticed a few issues with those formats in our early postings. Make sure you always have this thing with you when you're writing. This is my 3rd copy. I've worn out the other 2 in the last 10 years or so. You can see I have tabs. Those are chapter 6 and 7 because those are the 2 chapters you're going to use the most. I also have a tab for the paper format. But I never write without this. This is never very far from my desk if it's not on my desk. It's the most important book you will have in your doctoral studies and thereafter if you're doing research. So make sure there will be some things that will become second nature. I don't need to look up book citations or book references anymore. But there are some things, if it's some government published thing, those are unique and I don't remember those. So I always have it handy when I need to reference or cite something or look up the formatting for that. So keep that with you. Make sure you're checking it. By the way, your textbook doesn't properly follow APA formatting for citations and references, so be careful about following it. Again, textbooks are written for a certain purpose, and they don't strictly follow APA. They kind of do, but they don't strictly do it. And so they take a little poetic license with their APA style in textbooks. Let's see, what else? I would caution against using the titles of books you're referencing or the full names of authors. It's sufficient just to say what you're going to say and cite it, do a citation which has the author's last name and the date, and then you have a reference that tells us what the book title is. And if we want to know more, we can go from there. So really, it just kind of fills up the page. Again, they do it a lot in textbooks because they're written for a different point. But for our purposes, you really don't need to include titles. It's really kind of just taking up space. Just properly cite it. It'll tell us where things are coming from, and obviously the reference has the title in it, so we know. And also, when you're writing, avoid quotes at this level, unless it's a seminal thought that you really can't properly rephrase. It's okay to cite that. It's okay to quote that, but there really isn't anything else you should be quoting. You should be putting in your own words and citing it. For 2 reasons. One, if you're just putting in a bunch of quotes, that all it tells us is you know how to cut and paste because you're just copying over somebody else's work. But if you're able to put it in your own words, it tells us you understand and can apply it. And that's the point. We're not just storing up knowledge here. We want to know how to apply it. How does this affect and inform our leadership? What we read today in these textbooks and these journal articles we're going to find, how do we take that tomorrow and apply it? So if you're just quoting a bunch of stuff, that just tells me you read and identified things and copied them. If you put them into your own words, it's helping me understand that you understand what this means. And then, like in our discussion post, as you're relating it to your experiences, I can say, yeah, you got it. You're applying it where it needs to be applied, the way it needs to be applied. You're making sense out of all of this. And that's the point. The real evidence of learning is successful application. It's not writing a paper or passing a test. You can go out and make it work and be successful with it and help other people. In our case, help other people, other organizations, help somebody get through change, help somebody be innovative, help somebody create and develop the culture that they need to do these things. That's the point. We just are in a academic setting, so we kind of have to stress a bit of the academic, but never lose sight of it's really about application, which is why in the discussions we ask you to relate to your experiences in life. So again, avoid quotes. And again, quotes don't count in your word count because it's not your work. Your word count, if it's 300 words, it's 300 of your words, not 100 of your words and 200 of things you've quoted from other people. And remember, you're writing in third person for APA. We allow you to write in first person for the discussions, although you don't have to. You can practice writing your third person writing skills in your discussions. That's quite all right. I would encourage that because it can be difficult and just takes practice. Once you're used to it, it's fairly simple, but getting used to it can be hard. And I understand that because I went through the process. But remember, when you get to your journal at the end of the week, you're writing in third person, which means no first person, no me, no my, no I. And you should never be using second person in anything you write because you're only speaking for you. So no we, no us, no our. The only time you get to use second person is when you have multiple authors. So if you were to do research, or if you find a journal article in your research, and it's got multiple authors, they'll be talking about their research in terms of plurality. So keep that in mind. Those are really all the things I have for this week. Enjoy your research. To me, that's really what it's all about. What you find and what you discover, and then how you apply it. So enjoy that. If you have questions, by all means, let me know. Drop me an email, reply to an announcement, or some other communication within the class, or send me an email. But at that, unless you have any specific questions, yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Just one question. As we do the journal entry that's due tomorrow, the formatting is typical of what we would do of any paper?
Yeah, and in fact, I've supplied a template that you can use, and if you use it, then I know all the formatting is correct.
Perfect.
If you want to attempt to do it on your own, go for it.
Nope, I downloaded it. I will use it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and I once I created that in my work, I use that for everything as a basis for my dissertation. Because once I did it, I didn't want to have to redo it. And frankly, the hardest thing was getting the running headers to work correctly.
Sure.
Once I figured that out, it's like, I'm never touching this again.
I agree with that statement.
So, it's there. Hopefully, it makes it easier for you guys. But yeah, you're basically writing a mini paper, a 2-page paper for your journals every week. So it's got to be formatted and the 2 pages don't count the title page. It's your writing. It's from your introduction to your conclusion. So it doesn't include the title page, doesn't include your reference or anything after that.
Okay.
You don't have appendices, but if you did, it wouldn't count those as well. So it's 2 pages of text, double space, which really is 1 page.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, that's what the weekly journals will look like. And again, it's really just building the skills for your final paper as well as building the skills for your dissertation.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you for reviewing everything. That was very helpful.
Good. Again, if there are any questions as we go along, by all means, let me know.
Okay. One other question. How do you pronounce your last name?
Treach.
Treach. Okay, Dr. Treach. Got it.
I mean, Dr. Rick, Dr. Treach, whatever you want, Professor. Whatever comfortable with, I'll pretty much answer to it.
Okay.
But anyways,
thank you again.
So, we'll wrap this up. Again, have questions throughout the week, let me know, and then we're back on next Saturday as well.
All right.
Have
a wonderful weekend.
You too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.